Playing at Business with Steve Reece, the business podcast with a sense of fun. To find out more, go to playingatbusiness.com.
Hello, and welcome to episode 8 of the Playing at Business podcast. I'm your host, Steve Reece, and today we're looking at the need for and the benefits of testing toys with kids. We're going to look at why we should, why we don't do it enough, and I'll also give you some key learnings from my own experience of testing toys with kids. So by way of introduction, I wanted to start off rather intellectually really, with a look at one of my favourite definitions of the word marketing. So my favourite definition of the word marketing is for marketing as a function to be the consumer voice in the kind of classic product development and manufacturing cycle. In other words, amongst all the other pressures that a business which churns out consumer products is under, that marketing should be the one that makes sure that there's a product that appeals to consumers at the end of that cycle. So we'll have engineering pressures, we'll have QA pressures, especially in toys, our customers, our retail customers, pressure us. But in the end, we kind of listen to these people more than we do to the end consumer. And the reality is that those jobs, those functions themselves actually depend upon the end consumer finding the product to be desirable and worthy of purchase. So it's always struck me as kind of silly that, very often if you talk to toy folk about the way that we work, our kind of general business model in toys, especially if you compare it with other industries, we kind of throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. This is so different from some other sectors. Earlier in my career, I did consumer research into financial products, and whilst it wasn't particularly thrilling to talk to consumers about credit cards or direct mail or bank accounts, actually what was very interesting was to see just how seriously financial institutions take the creation of and the launch of a new product. Obviously we don't, and hence that kind of idea about throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks. Now, to me, one of the reasons for this is based on the fact that roughly speaking, between about 2/3 to 3/4 of all toy products on shelf are new each year. There might be a refresh of something else, or it might be a new sequel to a movie, but effectively they're new products, new SKUs on the shelf each year. It's always struck me as crazy that we put so much effort into getting each one of these kind of onto the shelf, when then as soon as it's done we need to bang out the next year's range. The toy industry must be one of the least efficient in terms of new SKUs developed and productivity of new SKUs developed. And the reason why I say that is that of the roughly 1/3 to 1/4 of products which are carry forward each year, i.e. they sold the year before, of that 1/3 to 1/4, the significant minority of products actually on shelf, they account for roughly round about 60 to 70% of the total sales in the toy industry. So in other words, we're churning away developing this huge amount of products every single year on a kind of ongoing hamster wheel basis in order to produce only 1/3 of the sales. So if we could have more of our products which carried forward from year to year, we wouldn't have to develop so many products. We'd save a huge amount on licensing costs, perhaps on inventory, on marketing costs, but also risk of launching these things, because not everything that launches works. So if you incur license, inventory and marketing costs at risk when you could just take some simple steps to get your products on shelf again next year, it's not really very prudent business model. Actually you'll find that most people who've come into the toy industry and had a very license driven business eventually realise that it's a complete hamster wheel, and it's a very difficult and stressful and sometimes painful hamster wheel to ride. And my big thing has always been with toy companies, if we actually tested our products more with the end consumer, i.e. children, and went out of our way to ensure we were hitting the right note, we would actually significantly, not entirely, because it's still going to be a hit and miss business, and research is not perfect. It doesn't always give you the answers that are, that are useful. It doesn't always give you answers that are right, but certainly a degree of research is going to make it more likely that we'll find success than not. So I guess one of the reasons why I'm such an advocate of testing toys with kids is because I've spent a reasonable amount of my career actually doing just that. So I'm actually trained as a qualitative market researcher, which to the layman means I do focus groups, I guess. For most of my time in and around research, I've worked with children and their families. So I first tested a toy with kids back in, I think, 1998. Yes, I'm not old. And from memory, I think it was some kind of toy promotion with either coffee or tea bags or something along those lines. Since that date, and obviously I don't have an accurate number, I've not actually counted this properly, but I estimate I've conducted in the region of about 1,200 focus groups with kids and families, specifically about toys and games. And I guess one of the things I'd observe having done that is that you tend to see the same old things coming back time and time again. Sometimes I can foretell the answer before the research is done. And obviously I don't take that as given, and sometimes that kind of presumption is wrong. But some things don't change that much over time and from research focus group to focus group. So I guess overall it tends to be very consistent. I've actually never, amongst those 1,200 focus groups, I've never conducted a toy research project where the client, or in some cases my internal colleagues, didn't find it really useful and insightful. And there's probably primarily two reasons for that, actually. One is, frankly, having done 1,200 focus groups, I'm not looking to do more where there's no logical answer or rational answer or helpful answer can come out of those groups. So I don't tend to let people waste their time and money on bad research where it's going to have unclear outcomes, frankly. But also, in general, most people in the toy business, and this sounds crazy to say, but it is absolutely true, the vast majority of people, and certainly the vast majority of companies in the toy industry, are far too far removed from their end consumer, which is kids. Even those who have kids will tend to come into meetings and say, well, I tested it with my kids and they loved it. But are these kind of generally affluent and middle-class kids of toy company executives typical? No. And they're also obviously very toy savvy because they talk to their parents about toys all the time. So, frankly, that's probably better than not talking to any kids at all. But you certainly can't presume that one set of kids are representative. Having said that, though, there's one level of probably one area, one job function where the vast majority of people are in their 20s and normally haven't spent much time with kids since they were kids themselves, maybe a decade or a decade and a half previously. And that's toy designers. Aside from the external professional toy invention and toy design companies where you get all kinds of ages and experience is obviously really valued. Typically in toy companies themselves, most designers who are actually hands-on designing kids, they're normally in their 20s, certainly if it's a bigger company. So, generally speaking, they're the people who need the most input and interaction with the end consumer, and normally are the people who have the least, sadly. And I think that, in my experience, there are several areas which toy research nearly always sheds light on. And the fundamental number one thing, which I guarantee that if you test toys in a methodologically robust way, and I'm trying my hardest to keep any kind of jargon or overly intellectual research theory out of this podcast, but if you test things in the right way with a reasonable size sample, don't just rely on one group, do at least 4 ideally if you can. Try and do them in different places, different demographics, all that kind of stuff. But generally speaking, I would say you can virtually guarantee that you can check with focus groups with kids on the following. Dexterity. Can the child actually use this toy or not? This sounds ridiculous to test, but I remember testing one product on one of the largest toy brands in the world, and it was a product that had been in market for a long time, but it had started very well because conceptually it was really appealing, and then sales had died off. And when I tested it with kids, not only could I not do it, although that's not really, frankly, much of a qualification, but the average engineer would have struggled to actually take this toy apart and put it back together again in the way that it was meant to be. So dexterity, fit, the suitability of the product for the stage of development the child is at is a huge thing. The size, so obviously children's hands are smaller. In a 5-year-old versus an 8-year-old, the hand size can be quite significantly different. And if you've got a designer who's 20, well, it actually doesn't really matter after the age of about 18, I guess. An adult designer has a much bigger hand than the target consumer if you have a toy which is aimed at like 4 to 7-year-olds. So will the toy fit? And again, another product I can think of which tested very well conceptually and performed very well in the first year, but then kind of died away. And the main issue was it was far too large for the average child's hand, and there weren't enough kind of design amendments made to allow for the fact that it was bigger. The functionality fit, can kids do it? I guess all this is really what in other worlds you might call the user experience, really. Some other considerations in this area. Preschool kids tend to use feel or touch before they use sight in order to check a toy out. So, the consideration that goes to the way it looks is one thing, but the consideration that goes to the way it feels is another thing. And actually the feel, the sensory stimulus from touch is in some ways much more important for preschool kids. So if you've never actually put it in front of any preschool kids, or if you spent all your time making it look as close to the character or making it just generally look as cool as possible, you're not necessarily going to hit the mark. Frankly, the most recurrent, I guess, argument or conversation, I don't tend to have too many arguments, but certainly the most heated, I guess, recurrent heated conversations I have in toys have been with product designers. And this is when they're convinced they're the designers, it's their product, however they've made it is perfect. But the reality is when you put it in the hands of a kid, it clearly does not work for that child. So needless to say, they rarely take my advice up front, but then when I finally get them in front of a child and say, look, please look at this now, they suddenly go, oh, right, now I understand. So, sometimes it's just a case of needing to see it to believe it. And I guess the other thing is, just the bottom line on this whole area is, some categories of toys, the play experience is actually secondary. Something which has got a really strong in and out license. I mean, the reality is you're not going to sell it for that long. Should we be trying to make really great toys? Yes, but the reality is, as we all know, it's not going to be in the market for long enough really for the quality of the play pattern to be the determining factor. It's going to be driven by the strength of the license itself. However, there are many toys where the play experience itself is actually the critical thing that will drive the future success of that product, that will drive year 2 and onward sales, will give you perennial sales. And, in the end, that's really what this is all about. So, in which case, don't you think it might be a good idea to get kids hands-on with them at some point in the process? Surely so. I think the other thing which I've definitely observed, and I guess this is partly because it's normally the marketing teams who instruct consumer testing on toys in general, in this industry at least. The key marketing message is so critical. Basically it boils down to, why would kids want to buy or be given, or to pester to be given this product versus all the other hundreds of thousands of toys out there? And there are literally hundreds of thousands of toys out there. The answer to that question is largely going to determine how successful your product is commercially. And one of the things I've definitely found over these 1,200 plus focus groups is that consumer testing can often highlight the primary attractive features of your product. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of a spoiler warning here. The key appealing features aren't always what you expect, or which your customers expect, or which your boss demands. Okay, here's the reality. Sometimes it's something different. And in the same way as, you'll always find people say, I bought this for my child and they prefer to play with a cardboard box. It's actually the same in this situation. This was made to work this way, but they're not using that way. So what are you going to do? If the majority of users are using it in a different way to the way you planned, do you need to call out the message differently? And the answer is probably yes. If you're going to invest hundreds of thousands, or for a few companies, millions in advertising, you might be as well to check that out. Speaking from personal experience, I once had to reshoot a TV ad for a 6-figure amount because the advert completely missed the target audience, in the sense that it was not relevant to them. They had no clue what the product was about. They didn't know why the way it was being presented made it appealing, because that didn't appeal to them. It wasn't relevant to them. So in the end, we produced a new insight-driven advert, and lo and behold, that was much more successful commercially. I think the other really critical thing, and I think this is an area where nearly everybody would have to say that perhaps they could be a bit more astute and a bit more kind of cognizant of the need to understand what the competition are doing, and also critically to understand how your end consumer sees the competition versus how they see your products and your brands. So, the reality is, you put your product out there, it's not on offer to the consumers in a vacuum unless you've got some kind of direct-to-consumer initiative. If you've got some kind of crowdfunding, you may get a degree of vacuum. But the reality is, to sell in massive mass market volumes, you're not in a vacuum away from your competitive set. So why would you ever test a product or just talk about your product from your own perspective only? Why wouldn't you look at your competitors? I mean, it's just logical, isn't it? The big question I find is your product liked or loved? So, excuse my Northern English tones, but the difference between being liked or loved is that, one can be an also-ran and one can be a huge hit. And in research testing, you can compare these product features that you have versus your competition, the marketing message, generally the factors that stimulate word of mouth and other things. If you go for an ego test, which says your product's fine, maybe you could tweak this or tweak that, that's one thing. But if you actually test it against your competition and you work out where you really sit, then you can truly begin to develop product that meets the consumer need and which also meets the competitive threat that you're facing. The final area which I've found to be surprisingly insightful and helpful for toy companies when conducting research with kids is identifying new product opportunities. We often presume that new product opportunities come from, the professional toy invention agencies, from the occasional, new toy inventor who kind of comes up with something totally out there. And you know what? In no way, shape or form am I saying that's not important. It is. It's an absolutely fundamental part of the toy industry. I'm a huge supporter of the inventor community. But actually, if you look at bigger companies, often the product development initiatives are more insight driven. And certainly if you look outside of the toy industry towards the more kind of generally corporate, dare I even say professionally run kind of companies and kind of industries, they tend to have insight driven products. Here's a gap in the market, the consumer clearly needs this, they're clearly going to respond to this, why don't we develop a product from scratch to fill that? And of all the things all the areas that the biggest surprise for people when doing research, it would be this, identifying those new product opportunities basically. So in summary, I guess the major global toy companies, frankly, these guys are conducting significant amounts of research testing with kids, and fair play to them for doing that. But outside maybe the top 4 or 5, and apologies if there's someone else a bit further down the pecking order who's really big on this, but generally speaking, outside the top 4 or 5 toy companies, in my experience, research testing with kids is sorely lacking. So, if you want to get more than 1/3 of your products to carry forward to the next year, so you can make more profit, so you can have more stable sales, so you can not have to lay your staff off as soon as you have a license which dies, maybe actually testing your product with kids will provide some insights towards that. And if you've had more products fail than perhaps you should have done, again, maybe you need to review your previous products and your competitive set with the end consumer to make sure you're not missing something really obvious. It takes very little. I mean, obviously, as a person who professionally provides this service, I'm gonna position this as a good thing. But aside from that, if you go and book into to visit a school or a play group or a scout group or get employees' kids in, really, is that complicated or expensive or time consuming? No, it's not. And especially when you look at the actual implications of not doing this, and partly the reason why we don't is because we have all these other pressures on us, and this is not, generally speaking, a fundamental part of our process. So I'd like to see much more research testing for toys with kids. And I mean, aside from my own work in that area, there are many people out there who offer a great service for doing this. But above all, in the end, probably the best thing to do is develop this capability in-house. In fact, that was my first start in the toy industry, was testing toys for kids in-house for a major toy company. So there you go. That concludes this episode of the Playing At Business podcast. I hope you found it interesting. As ever, if you would like to have us cover a particular topic, please feel free to get in touch. Please do give us hopefully good reviews where you find us online. It does help us to keep going and to keep providing this podcast. And if you want to get in touch with us about the podcast or find out what we do for a day job in the toy world, our toy business consultancy is Kids Brand Insight, which can be found at www.kidsbrandinsight.com. So yeah, thanks a lot and bye until next time.
Playing at Business with Steve Reece, the business podcast with a sense of fun. To find out more, go to playingatbusiness.com.